Sam Powell Comic Hour with your host, Andrew Glonner.
And Chris Ramos. Hello.
Today we are going to review Absolute DC New Frontier.
This is a comic actually that has been out for quite some time, but we've been focusing on the different editions that have been coming out. And the DC New Frontier was a series that ran in 2004. And there were 6 issues. So it was a mini series, and that was really all they were going to do about it. So 6 issues ran, and writer and artist Darwyn Cooke and colorist Dave Stewart.
Yes. It's an amazing story, and it's one of my favorite Darwyn Cooke books. And probably, I doubt it'll take a lot to top of it.
Yeah, and it's probably one of the ones that he's most famous for.
Yeah.
I mean, Darwyn Cooke has a really pronounced art style, and as soon as you see it, you start connecting it to like maybe the Batman animated series that was Bruce Timm, and you might see people talking about it as if like it's too simple, like simplistic sort of, like a throwback a little bit, like the way the 50s,
40s, 50s,
40s, 50s pinups, or the way that some of the sort of Archie comics, things like that, maybe. But
and what I've read and doing my research, his art styles is it was described as one of our medium's true innovators, comparing him to bold and direct style with Joe Kubert, Alex Toth, and Jack Kirby. And especially Jack Kirby, this was definitely like not so much that he copied a style, but they both have so unique and bold art styles.
Yeah, like the characters themselves literally leap off of the page because they're always up front. Something's always happening. And, the other part of when you're looking at like an artist or their style, you have to kind of connect. Are they just doing this as a style for the story, or is this like their style, like their unique way of doing things?
Right.
And I think this has become so acclaimed because you can just tell that this is like the way he expresses himself as an artist and really moves the story along. And I mean, you are right there. Almost every page you flip through, there's characters all around in each frame. So it's like you're right there, like ground level with these guys.
Yeah. It's incredible. I love this book so much.
Well, let's talk about the characters that are in the book. So it's DC Comics. And I think what happened with why this story became so popular is because at the time in the early 2000s, comics were, not like they were floundering a little bit, but they were just trying to come up with, what do we do with these characters that people have known forever? You know,
it's kind of like the fallout of the 90s too. And art styles are different and changing, and they're trying to figure out what people are getting drawn to.
Yeah, so they tried to say, well, why don't we just take these characters and retell stories of old? Like there were gaps. How did Batman handle year 3 and 4, or what did Wonder Woman do before she came from Themyscira over to the mainland? So I think this was a perfect jumping point for a lot of new readers because it introduced them to like the golden age roots of these characters.
Right. And I guess going into this book, you don't have to have any prior knowledge of characters,
right?
Or any continuity. You don't have to know anything. You can just jump right in. And that's the beauty of this book as well, besides the art styles. And if you like any of the animated shows like Justice League Animated or Justice League Unlimited, you definitely have a heart for these characters and the style of those characters, Batman animated series, stuff like that. You have the heart and passion of these characters, and he's basically doing it through a comic adaptation.
Yeah. So I guess what happens in the book, to just sort of really generalize through the whole storyline, is it starts in 1945. So it's sort of at the end of what people would consider the golden age.
Yep.
The golden age of comics, the golden age of superheroes. And that's kind of where the bigger superheroes, the most popular that we know of,
Yep.
sort of got their start. Superman, Wonder Woman,
Yep.
some of the Shazam things like that,
Yeah.
Captain Marvel. That was sort of their beginning point. And the comic itself spans like 15 years or something like that.
I could believe it.
It
I
goes
could
into the
believe it. Yeah.
60s, and it
Yeah.
goes
Yeah.
into the Korean War, and it goes into
In Vietnam.
Kennedy,
Yep.
John F.
Kennedy.
Kennedy.
Oh.
In fact, that's where the new frontier comes from. That's John F. Kennedy's
Yep. Speech.
slogan,
Yep.
look to the skies.
So
kind
they
of thing.
have actually adapted this comic into a movie adaptation that came out. I think it was like 5-10 years ago or something now. But it did a good job at capturing this book. Darwyn Cooke did have some influence and some writing on it. But it doesn't have all the content that this book does. This book definitely has more story to it, more characters, stuff that he wanted to include in the movie, but it was just going to be too long and too much to keep track of. And so he had to kind of put at least some of his writing and some of his influence when they did the movie.
Yeah. And, to pull aside from the movie into like the reading experience, I just want to spend a moment and kind of talk about the different formats of comics that we have been discussing on the podcast. We've touched a little bit on trade paperbacks. We've touched a little bit on
Single
omnibus
issues,
and
yeah.
absolutes and things.
Absolutes, yep.
I guess the easy thing to break down is DC Comics and Marvel Comics have come up with their own formats for how they're going to collect stories. So if you think about just a regular comic book, it's roughly, page size. It's like 7 inches wide. And what do we got here? 7 by 10.5. So that's a regular comic book, which is shrunk down from the original artwork. So when an artist actually does the pencils and coloring, it's like 40% bigger than this.
Yeah.
So they work on these panels, and then
I think they're
pull
like
out
11 by
panels.
17 most of the time.
Yeah, and then they shrink it down to kind of tighten up all of those lines.
Mhm.
And then what they do is they take all of those single issue comics and either turn them into a trade paperback, which is literally like a floppy cover.
Yep.
And it's about the same size as a comic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they usually take entire runs. So like this absolute New Frontier is 6 comics. So they'll take those 6 comics and put them into a trade paperback. A lot of times they'll do an oversized copy, which is roughly 9 inches wide by 11 inches tall, where you feel like it's getting closer to the normal size of art, just a little bigger collected edition. I think they usually do that for some of the hardcovers that they want to emphasize on the shelf.
Right. So the Black Label books are just a little bit bigger than the OHCs that Marvel's put out and some of the Rebirth Deluxe editions that DC has. But this new Black Label book that we'll be talking about in an upcoming episode, Wonder Woman, Dead Earth, that's a little bit of a different style for them that they're putting out. And I like it because it's still hardcover, but it's a little bit and still bigger than the single issue, but it's smaller than the absolute. And so it's a nice medium, and it's also more affordable as well.
Now I've always been told to, just from publishers and other bookstores, is that comic book stores and bookstores have to treat their shelves like real estate.
Yeah.
So they have to
I've heard
think
that as
about
well.
how is that going to fit on my shelf and how many copies can I hold? Because if you could hold one 1,200 page book, that's $125, or you could hold 4 oversized books that are $50 each,
Right.
you'd have a better chance of selling those 4 books and making more money than trying to just find someone that's going to grab that one
Big
high-priced book.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then it brings us to DC's Absolute line. Now that's kind of like a specialty to DC. They came out with the Absolute editions.
People have been trying to copy them.
Yeah.
But I think they still have the best binding compared to what the copies are. And
they have
like
a nice
image,
slip case,
the best slip case.
Cardboard slip case. But an Absolute is about 8.5 wide by 12 and a half tall.
Hmm.
So you're really
Yeah.
getting to that point where it's a nice oversized art. And the reason why I'm explaining all of this is because some comics and stories don't translate all that different in an oversized format. You
Yep.
know, it's like, that's cool. But Darwyn Cooke, like, you
Oh yeah,
have to
made
read
for
it.
it.
You-
And I guess to clarify, they don't put every single book or every single story into absolute format or oversized formats. It depends what sells well, I think, and what like the hype is about, or I guess in some cases probably what art translates to well, what there's a calling for, what they think might do well because of it ties into a movie or television that's coming out, and they're trying to correspond with the release. So it's always cool to see these great grandeur stories in an oversized format.
yeah, you know, if you take a comic that was written and colored and produced in 1955 and you oversized it, it might not translate very well unless they digitize it or they remaster it.
Yep.
So if you just can't just take any artwork and just sort of blow it up a little bit, because you just lose some of that quality. But I'm telling you, this absolute New Frontier, every line is sharp, every black is black, every spot is. It's just an amazing read.
I know.
Um,
Before we get into this, I know I got into collecting oversized editions because Ramos showed me the Killing Joke,
yeah,
Absolute Edition, and I was like, "What is this?" And I was awestruck because it was the first time I've ever seen anything like it. None of my friends owned anything like that, and we were like, "What? Okay, what's this? All right." And then he kind of showed me what an Omni was, and I was like, "All right." And we kind of looked around and seen what it was, and now I might actually have more than what he does.
I think so.
So I do respect like showing like especially new readers, or not new readers, but readers that have been collecting trade paperbacks and single issues for so long, and then showing what an oversized format is. It's like night and day.
Yeah, I mean, it's always fun to find something in your hobby that takes it to that next level. So, there's a lot of people who have read, I think we talked like people reading Harry Potter or people reading Lord of the Rings or, really any sci fi book. There's always some like master copy out there. There's always something that's like a leather bound cover with,
Right.
gold embossed and,
Right.
imprints and slipcases. And I think everyone that is really into having a nice quality piece that you just either enjoy holding and reading, or you just would think about, what, someday my kids will want to read this, and this is how it's going to be held up as a nice hardbound cover. Um, the reason why they make them so nice too is because they can change the gloss of the paper and they can really hold all of the colors of the book. I mean, nothing's faded, nothing's bleeding from one page to the next. I mean,
Right. It'll stand the
they've really
test
figured
with
out.
time pretty well.
Yeah.
And I guess what I viewed for oversized and some of the older editions, like the Omnis and stuff, it's stuff that you'll never be able to read on just like a floppy or a trade paperback. Like
Right.
they're going to collect all that edition from like the 60s, the 50s, maybe even 40s, depending on what you're reading, Golden Age, whatever. And having that ability to see that remastered, how the artist and writer were meant to put it out, that's such a cool thing to have. So
Well, now you can read everything digital, and so
yeah,
it's like nice to just actually
you hold it and
hold
everything
that too.
Yeah.
Um,
Now
so
diving
let's
into
get
the
back to the story. Now we know what's going on.
Yes. So, DC New Frontier. This is kind of also like a origins of Justice League, but it's not the central focus. But it is something that does happen in this book.
Yeah, it introduces the characters that will eventually form the Justice League.
Yeah.
And I think it's cool. The beginning of the book has sort of the Trinity,
Yep.
Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman, because they were some of the first superheroes to actually come out. So if you're
Yeah.
talking like late 40s, early 50s, yeah, that's
Right.
them.
And I like all the cool mentions and story is as we delve into the book. The story of the losers. The losers were like such a precursor to war comics and everything, and they were one of the ones in there in the like the 40s, 50s that were doing it, and Sergeant Rock and things like that. And so to have those characters kind of take on a new light in this book was so cool. And the way they fight their like first antagonist stuff like dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And the art of Darwyn Cooke bringing these war comics together with a like fighting dinosaurs, like the extraordinary terrestrial thing. It's just it's eye catching. It stands out so much.
And it's kind of fun because it reads like a period piece film, like you have no, I'm trying to say, like, you have no choice but to just be drawn into the way he draws. And you just feel like this is a hopeful, sort of happy-go-lucky story, but then it gets serious.
It does.
And then
it
you're
gets
like,
dark.
okay.
It's like a war comic where like you lose buddies, and there's like some PTSD stuff going on later. And these are definitely characters. I guess all the characters that he develops in this book, you want to keep notes of and keep track of because he will bring them back.
Right. And well, and
or what he can. Yeah.
As simplistic as his art is, I guess I don't want to dummy it down because it's amazing, but as simplistic as it is, he still has a pretty deft like swing to the way he does his characters, where you can connect them. Like his male figures kind of all look the same. They have sort of that real chiseled jaw, and like kind of like the 50s sort of war guy,
right.
with the squinty eyes. And but there's always something unique about them, so that when they pop up later on, you're like,
that's him.
I've seen that guy. Yeah. Like that's the guy with the scar across his eye. I mean, he just always comes up with something. And it really helps you to connect the stories and realize that time has passed, because like I said, it jumps around from city to city, but it also jumps around from year to year a little bit, becomes chronological. Fun fact in here too is when the Flash appears, that's the same year that he appeared in the comics. And then when the Green Lantern appeared, that's the same year
that's smart.
that he appeared in the comics. So
I see what you're doing there, Darwyn Cooke.
Yeah, like wait, no, it's 1962.
Right.
So they really do connect that idea of superheroes evolving with the decades. And I know we've touched on that a little bit in the past.
Of course. Let's see. Okay. And so these splash pages, especially with the guy jumping into the dinosaur to blow it up, that was nice touch. Nice touch. Like his splash pages in this book, the single page splash pages, man, they are just on point. They're like stuff you want to hang on the wall. We could talk and just say we love Darwyn Cooke for a while. But.
Well, his panels are huge.
Yes.
I mean, most people will do 6 or 8 panels a page. He does 3.
Oh, that's a good point.
He keeps his panels huge so that his artwork
stands out and
can really shine. Because his line work is pretty bold. It's like almost like a calligraphy pen. It's really strong.
Yeah.
Whereas some other artists you see have little tiny hash marks, like little tiny. His are just bold. And the reason why I like it is because it's confident. Like he draws a line.
Oh,
and it's like, boom, that's the line.
Yeah. And then so we're kind of brought a JSA in this book. We get kind of mentions of them, and in this story that it's kind of like in modern comics, the Superhuman Registration Act, except like in the 50s. They kind of he brings that out. He just like the DC version where they were either forced to register or turn themselves in, and they choose, like JSA chooses to disband. We still have folks like Shazam that he's all for it, and folks like Batman who's trying to evade it.
And like the Spectre just leaves.
And the Spectre, he becomes like this. Well, he was on the JSA. I think in the Golden Age, he was a Golden Age character, and then he kind of got bigger than life.
Yeah, I guess that's
so
true.
they took him in a whole different direction with that. So it's kind of cool to see, how these characters transition as well.
Well, and it kind of goes with their character, if they had a choice to register with the government as a superhero so that everyone knows who you are, it makes sense that Batman would just sort of not do that.
Right. And he was, and I guess that's a good point, is also like, this is golden age. This is like 40s, 50s mentality where, and if it's Batman, because he started out in, well, yeah, the
1940.
yeah,
Yeah.
1940. So, I mean, he still has his like pointed ear costume. So that's cool to see.
Yeah.
But he still has that mentality of, I guess that new mentality of like, he's going to play it under the radar but still try to do some good.
Yeah. I mean, the other cool part about the story too is that not only is it telling its own story, but it kind of gives the reader this sort of history of the
Yeah.
time periods,
Mhm.
the Flash costume and even Superman's costume.
Yeah.
They're real big throwbacks to when they
Mhm.
first came out as characters. And I always thought it was kind of funny that the characters back then were drawn real boxy, like real A-frame kind of guys. And then they just sort of put a costume on that person. Like it would just be like an oversized shirt or something.
Mhm.
It wasn't until later, like in the, 80s and 90s where they came up with, now we're going to chisel out every single ab and every single
Oh,
arm,
yeah,
every
that was
tricep,
90s. Yep. His
and
armor and plated.
yeah, and
all
then
that.
everyone's going to wear just like skin tight latex. So it's like they started with no costume and then just sort of painted the
Well,
figure
they
on.
overkilled it.
Yeah. So when superheroes first came out, back in the day, their costumes were functional to the point of like maybe they came up with them in their own home,
Right.
or
Yeah.
Wonder Woman's costume itself is armor, and
Yep.
and Green Lantern's costume is sort of
His
made from
imagination. Yeah.
fabric
Right.
in the ring.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah. So it is cool that they touch on that kind of idea too. Keep
um,
them old school.
another thing throughout this book is they have like news bloopers or bleep or strips or whatever, and they kind of give you in about 2 pages they kind of give you this sense of time, what's going on in politics around them, and gives you a sense of place. What I also like is that they give you almost the first of appearance or the first fight of Batman and Superman.
Yeah.
And there is more to this story and to this panel and later in the book, I think it was, I don't know if so that's another thing I should bring up quick. You have the original edition of Absolute, and then I have the 15th anniversary.
Yeah. So my Absolute was printed in 2006.
Yep.
And it has 464 pages. Andrew's Absolute was printed like
This is like 2019.
2019. And when they reprint something, usually they add stories that maybe weren't part of it, or they add some more artwork, or they add some more special features. So like in an Absolute edition, well, this one in particular, there's 464 pages. 406 of those is comic.
Yep.
And then the 58 remaining pages are like cover art, the sketchbooks. Usually they'll put like a script in there, and they'll kind of talk about like how they made the comic. And then when they reissue it, reprint it, like Andrew's 2019 copy.
Right. So my comic New Frontier goes to 409, 409 pages. And then my extras go to 422. And then there is 3 new specials that are collected in here. And at the end of the day, the overall Absolute edition has 528.
Yeah. So Andrew's has like 50 more pages than mine.
So not a lot, but there's also some cool content that's in there.
And, for completists or people who are like, I want all of this story, or maybe you've read the first edition and then you're like, wow, I can't believe there's more that they can add into this. And then they do.
Yep.
A lot of times you'll see that, but it's just important to note that different editions of the comics are usually not just straight reprints. They usually try to make it a little more bang for your buck, where you're part of it.
Yeah.
But the story and everything else, I mean, they always collect all of that top to bottom.
All the same. Yeah. So anyway, yep, Batman and Superman first fight. They do, in at least the newest edition of DC New Frontier, they do have the origin of how this fight went, and it's really cool to see all the nuances of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really cool. And then we kind of transition. I like that we get origins of each character, of at least of I believe the Flash we get a brief origin of, and it's more the focus for the at least the origins is more of the Green Lantern.
Yeah, because they kind of pepper his character through the book. And
Yes.
you kind of like, oh, and and people who are familiar with the characters are like, oh, Hal Jordan, I know that name.
Yep.
And then you're like, that's Green Lantern, but he's not Green Lantern. So then you kind of wait, and it's like, oh, there he is again.
Yep.
I always like when they have him cross with like Lois Lane, and then
Yeah,
like Jimmy
because
Olsen's there, and
yeah,
then like
when they were in Nam, yeah,
Barry
they did
Allen.
crossover, yeah.
So they just kind of have fun with that because a lot of times, and I know especially in this story, Darwyn Cooke knows that people who are reading this are either comic fans, so they would pick up on these little nuances, or they're new readers, and then as they get introduced to comics, and then they read other things, and they come back to this, they'll say, "Oh, that's a nice touch because I get the reference now." It's sort of like you had to be there, and then later on you find out what that is, and you're like, "Oh, I get it now."
Yeah,
So it's a cool way to do that, I think.
for sure. Yep. So then, it's really cool to follow, Hal Jordan, his origin, and I like when you said, he's scattered throughout the book. Darwyn Cook kind of takes his time at developing Hal Jordan, the Green
Mhm.
Lantern, and I really like that because you get more invested in him and the characters around him and the universe as well. And I guess another cool origin that's in here is John Jones, the Martian Manhunter.
Yeah, I mean, he does a great job with the Martian Manhunter
Right.
because sometimes I think he's a sort of a side character that people don't really, pick up on right away.
Right.
But I mean, he makes him a really important
And
character.
I think like most of Martian Manhunter's origin and I guess other adaptations, it's kind of been like, oh, he was there, he's an alien from Mars. But
Mhm.
I guess in this story, they give him like personality, character, how he's kind of interacting with everyone, how he's picking up on humanity and becoming more human. Like it's very cool. And then you transition to Wonder Woman, who is kind of at odds with her and Superman, where like she is more feminist, I guess, if you want to describe it that way, or she's rooted in like trying to save people and not play by all the government's rules. And so she and Superman are kind of arguing throughout this book of who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, and the way that they've always written their dynamic is that Wonder Woman's first priority was always to protect Themyscira,
Hmm.
and Superman's first priority was always to protect mankind. So she kind of has this I'm a goddess, and I'm in charge of these people,
Right.
and these are my people, so I don't have to follow the rules of the world. Where Superman kind of has that
Loyalty to
somewhat
the
like,
U.S. government at
yeah,
the end of the
like,
day.
well, you should follow the rules of man, and she's
Yep.
like, no, I don't want to.
Right.
So that's where they've always butted heads because he has this idea of truth, justice, and the American way,
Yep.
and that's
Yep.
his
And
thing.
Wonder Woman's like, I'll meet you halfway there. On that." So
Like,
that's really cool, especially in the setting of Vietnam. That I think is the perfect place for them to kind of explore and develop the relationship and how they're different, how they're the same, and
well, like
kind
Wonder
of
Woman's a warrior,
yep,
and like she fights, and then she knows that there's going to be casualties in war, and then she
yeah,
knows that sacrifices have to be made. And Superman, when he was written in the 40s and 50s, they had him fighting in World War II. A lot of his storylines were just part of that, as all of the
hmm
superheroes at the
yeah,
day were. And Superman, in the comics was a big rally cry for democracy and independence in
sure, that
America.
makes total sense now.
Yeah,
Reading that.
like that was like
Yeah,
his thing, and like he
hmm
sold war bonds. Like
yeah,
Superman, like
yeah, it's true. Yeah,
do that. And Wonder Woman, I think she just sort of had that sort of independent streak. She was out at the same time, but
she was representing female heroes.
yeah, and
Mm,
she didn't really necessarily need to connect to the armed forces. She sort of
right.
had her own
Right,
story.
unless they forced it,
Yeah,
yeah.
and so it is a great way for her to be introduced as a what would her character do in this setting. What would she
Yes.
do?
Right.
And Darwin did a great job writing that.
Exactly. And then we kind of just see the story naturally develop. There is an overarching story of a villainous alien species that comes in, but Darwin Cook kind of spreads like Easter eggs. I mean, not so much Easter eggs, but just little plot points throughout the book, and so it develops and grows throughout the story.
Yeah. And then it is cool because Superman sort of remains constant through the book. Batman remains constant through the book. Later on, you see Batman, and then Robin appears, and so
Yep.
they kind of follow along with like what was really happening in the comics of
Right.
that day.
I do like for Superman's costume that was it the Max Fleischer or whatever
Yeah.
the cartoon.
Yep.
That his costume's based on that.
That it looks like it's literally tucked into his
Good
trunks and
touch.
stuff.
Yeah.
But while we're talking about that, the colorist of the comics always plays an important factor.
Yep.
And we have some other podcasts that we're going to discuss. Wonder Woman, Dead Earth. We already talked about that a little bit, but every once in a while, an artist and a colorist and a writer and everyone sort of gels together,
Yep,
and
jams
you
out.
can tell that Darwyn Cooke and Dave Stewart were like a match.
Yeah.
A
made
match
for each
here.
other.
Yes, and he has the right color scheme to change the whole mood of a page instantly.
Mhm.
And Darwyn Cooke's expressions are like just subtle enough that you just catch, right away. Like if the whole page is dark colors, you're like, something's happening. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
it is really something else
And it's hard to imagine anybody else who would do it.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's just real slick.
Yeah.
It's not like it's
You're
forced.
like, oh, I wish blah 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 would have did this or blah 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 or did that. Nah.
Yeah.
It was made for each other.
Excellent.
Yeah. So I guess we kind of go throughout the book, amazing splash pages, different highlights, and bringing back old characters that people aren't super familiar with, but are still important to DC's history. We're seeing that, and just the characters eventually finding out, oh, we're all connected to each other somehow, introducing to each other and kind of building up.
Yeah. I mean, back in the day, also, all of these characters were introduced as regular characters in just comic book history, right?
Yeah.
And then one day they all came together. So
Right.
this book does a great job of introducing them as separate characters, and
But
then
it's more natural.
yeah, and then they kind of have to come together and work together, just because they are the world's strongest heroes. So
Yeah.
they it's not like they don't have a choice, but at the same time they're like, everyone is on at least the same wavelength of, we're going to have to help mankind, and I have powers to do that. And I think Flash might even say something similar to that.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah, he does that. I think when the heroes are all going to go fight the villain, and they don't know if they're coming back.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, yeah.
the villain is so like,
well, like Iris
overwhelming.
finds his and Iris
Yeah.
is like, are you the Flash?
well, sure.
He's like, I need that. Right.
But when she does that, it kind of harkens back to the Superhero Registration Act from the beginning of the book, where
Mhm.
he brings up those plot points again of like, I don't want to reveal myself because otherwise you might get hurt. Because she does get like, and she gets kidnapped at one point, and then when she finds it later, she's like, "You're the Flash."
Yeah. Well, he does say,
He
I
kind of
quit.
breaks that down. Yeah.
I quit being the Flash so you wouldn't be marrying a criminal. So
Yeah.
I didn't have to hide such a big secret from you. So, that's, I guess, in the real world, that's how superheroes would look at that, of like, I can either be a superhero or I could be a family man. I'm not going to be both.
Yeah.
And I guess that's kind of the trade-off for Batman too. And
Yeah, why Batman does what he does, because
he's totally
he's so invested. He's like, I'd rather do my own
it's like,
thing.
I'm going all in.
Yeah.
Bruce Wayne is going all
Right.
in. Sorry.
Flash has always been like that though, where he's trying to make everybody happy.
So then, once you kind of, walk through the storyline, there is a larger threat
Yep.
that
The
they
heroes can't
cannot
face on their own. Yeah.
Yes, they can't handle on their own, and everyone sort of has to realize, are we going to come together, or are we just going to hope someone else shows up? Or um, they kind of touch on the little cosmic characters coming in,
Yes, that is one of my
which is
favorite pages too. Of like
the greatest
where
part.
all of these panels are great. Where the Spectre
Doctor,
Doctor Fate
yeah,
and the Stranger and those guys are all just like, oh
they're like having lunch on the moon.
yeah, they're having like lunch on the moon. Like, should we help them? Let's see what they do first. And then if that all goes to hell, and we'll intervene. But
Because, I guess this is a good point to bring up. In Marvel Comics and DC Comics, there's sort of this structure of superheroes. And it's not just necessarily based on like your strength or your power level. It's some superheroes are created and focused for cosmic level things, like
yes,
big stuff, invading aliens or, galaxies colliding, things like that. And then some people are just made for ground level disturbances, or just, fighting ninjas or mobsters or something,
right.
and they're not going to like be having lunch on the moon. You're not going to have Daredevil and Spider-Man having lunch on the moon. But it's interesting when they bring those characters in, because it always, because Darwyn Cooke could have just left them out of the story.
Oh
He
yeah,
could have never mentioned
exactly.
anybody else.
When I first watched this like movie, they weren't even mentioned.
Yeah.
And so to read that and see that they're there, and at least they acknowledged it. But I still think I'm glad that he kept this really grounded story versus a big cosmic event. Because there could have been that story where it could have went cosmic and stuff.
Yeah, and it's like sometimes they just think of, well, the whole world isn't in peril. It's just that city. So to some cosmic level superheroes, they're like, it's not that
right.
bad.
It's on the Earth. Yes, the whole Earth is coming together to face this villain. But and also, I don't think magic was really a big deal till later in comics, at least DC comics.
Right. Like, well, the 60s was when that first was introduced, because they kind of had to do a pull away from
The hokiness,
the war, and then once the 60s came is when Isaac Asimov and a lot of other people started getting science-based, and that actually sort of happens through the story here with Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern and things. You kind of get more of this science fiction.
Challengers of the unknown make an appearance. And they have cool spaceship. They got a pal around.
Well, you compare that to Batman. You're like, Batman's a guy, and then this is like straight up science fiction.
Yeah.
And so they do have to kind of balance that out a little bit, which, I guess is how they've bridged the gap for the entire story is, each character has to evolve somehow. Something has to keep changing, and to show that they're growing and evolving as a character.
Right. They had to break away from the status quo.
Right. And that's exactly why they came up with new characters.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly why that all happened in comic book history, I guess.
Yeah. So this was again, just seeing how these characters evolve, come together. It's really self-contained, and I can't say about stuff. It's really cool, and just to see how they do it. They especially how they face the villain. It's a villain that even after seeing this in the movie, like they really struggle in this book compared to the movie, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's true. The way that the story is built is to show how each age of comics kind of evolves from one to the next. So, as we're getting towards the end of the story here, it makes sense to just touch a little bit on the history of comic books and time frames that are associated with them. So, if you're out there searching for comics, or you're looking for what age or period or what time frame to read, it started with the Golden Age. And what happened was somewhere around the 80s, they decided we're going to start structuring all of these blocks of time that have passed. DC Comics needed to do it more than Marvel, because DC Comics had so many characters that were aging in real life. Like,
Yep.
Batman was like 60 years old, and they're like, okay, we need to come up with a reason why Batman and Robin are still, in their 30s.
Yes.
So the way that it's structured is the golden age of superheroes started with Superman. So Superman came out 1938. The golden age lasts roughly from 1938 to 1956. The reason why that ended in 1956 is because they had taken all of the characters that they originally created. And at that time, it was really just DC Comics. Marvel didn't have a play in it. They had other comic books out there.
They were worried about getting their comic books out there. I think,
and there were other little groups of comics like Timely Comics and things, but they just didn't survive. So DC said, you know what? We've got the most popular comic book heroes. As the 40s progressed, they fought in the war. And then as the war was ended, they kept sort of coming up with other strategies of like, what do we do with these characters? Captain America is a really good example of that in what was the comic book runs at the time. Was now that World War II is over, what does Captain America do? So they just decided to freeze him in ice. So then in 1956, DC changed the way that they were coming up with superheroes because none of them were really sticking very well. So they came up with the Flash. And the Flash was considered the beginning of the Silver Age.
That's what I thought.
That's him. And when the Flash arrived, he was given his powers by an accident in a lab. And then it was like, bam, that's the Flash. So people really attached themselves to that.
Green Lantern, I think, followed.
And then the Justice League of America followed, and then Fantastic Four followed, and Spider-Man followed. And so everyone said, you know what? How can we get our new characters into the limelight? So the Silver Age actually lasts from 1956 to like 1970, 1975. So it's a pretty big span. And in that span is when like everything was created. The Silver Age brought like Marvel, it brought Jack Kirby, it brought the Hulk, it brought, just
everybody and anybody, Spider-Man, all your favorite characters, bam, they're there. That's where they started.
And then 1970, 1975 hit, and some of the writers decided to drop all of the hokey, gimmicky 50s and 60s sort of lighthearted stuff, and they started focusing on characters that had like flaws and problems. And DC started to write stories about like drug abuse and poverty. And
as much as they could get away with the comics code authority.
So. They just said, you know what, this is our real world. We're in the 70s now, and this is what's happening. And we're going to realize that our readers are aging. Readers were growing older, so they needed to keep those adult readers. And so they, the death of Gwen Stacy was in that time frame.
That's huge.
Giant Size X-Men came out in 1975.
Also a huge
relaunch. The X-Men were a connection point for...
they got canceled, so they had to bring it back from the dead.
So they used like racial injustice to say these are the X-Men. So Bronze Age went from 1970 to 1984. And then what changed into the modern age is, of course, 1986 came Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, and 1986 The Watchmen, and 1986 the Sandman. It's just they all hit, and that introduced what we call the modern age, and that's from 1985 to like today. So when Darwyn Cooke writes a story like this, he kind of has to connect all of those periods together, and then he also has to wrap it up at the end to say, these characters came together to form the Justice League of America. And so that's like, this story bridges the gap of the Golden Age through the Justice League of America, which was like the end of the Silver Age. So it is just really
6 issues.
Like he's like, I'm going to write this story.
They're a little long for issues, but they're still, it's got great pacing, so you won't even notice. You just kind of fly
so for like comic book historians or just people who just appreciate that there are time frames, it's sort of like the evolution of film too. We're going from silent films all the way into like IMAX theater films.
Yep.
How do you show that transgression? And I think that this is just the story to do it. It's a great jumping on point for anybody.
Yep. New reader friendly, old reader friendly. It's do you want to say it's a perfect book? We'll say it without saying it.
And then, it kind of ends with, like we said, it kind of ends with the great threat, of course. How is every good superhero story going to end? There's a great threat. They persevere.
Yes.
And they form the Justice League of America. And the Justice League of America in real life came out in 1960. So it is cool to say that this is, all of the heroes at the time, great splash pages of everyone sort of banding together and just becoming.
Yeah, this was the big one. Then.
Yeah, that's everyone's sort of doing the walk, the superhero
doing the
walk
from the movie. Yep. And
line up.
So in the movie they do bring up Kennedy's speech, and I think he does write it in here. I think somewhere
they have it.
Yeah, I think it was shortly after the part where I'm at, towards the back here. But he does do that, and do you think he wrote the story around that speech?
Well,
or do you think it had any influence on it?
I think what Darwyn Cooke always wanted to do is end it with the forming of the Justice League, right?
Yeah.
So I think he looked at when that was 1960, and the idea of the new frontier is being hopeful. Kennedy wanted everyone to look to the skies. They wanted us to do the space race. He wanted us to
all the things they kind of did in the book.
Yeah, like be hopeful. We can do great things.
Yep.
Mankind can rise. And it was just I think a great connection point for superheroes to just say, look to the sky, look up, hold your heads high. Kennedy's speech is printed in the back here, little excerpts, and his last line is, "We cannot fail their trust. We cannot fail to try." And it was just like, we're heroes. You have to do what you can do. And Darwyn Cooke did a great job of connecting that to just the reader, and just you can't help but to put this book down and say, you know what, I am going to try something. And that's why I love reading comics, because they connect it to real life to the point of escapism. They connect it to, this is our world and you should read it. And when you're in our world, you're in our world. But then when you leave it, how are you now taking what you learned and turning it into your world? So no, it's great. It's a great story.
And I think that about sums it up.
I think so. So buy the edition, buy the absolute edition, find it. They do have it on Amazon, used copies.
Yeah, still available. It's around.
It's not on in-stock trades. I just checked. And there's a few other comic book sites that I'm sure it pops up. Check eBay. People have collections that are, like I said, they're upgrading. They might have the first edition and they want to get to the 15th anniversary edition. So keep your eye out for there. But this one, buy as an absolute edition. That's the right way to do it. Yes. From us.
Right. This is Andrew Glonner
and Chris Ramos.
Signed off.